Right. Welcome to today's event on the Net Zero Industry Act. Welcome everyone over here and everyone who's following us online. This event is recorded online, and for now we will continue with the slide today. Thank you very much for signing up, for being here. The Net Zero Industry Act, it's a very critical item at the moment, and very hot topic, as this by some is the answer to the American program of the Inflation Reduction Act. We will see whether this is the case or not. But we're very excited to hear from our panelists today. We have the luxury to have Dr. Konrad Adenauer with us to share his perspective. And of course, you. My name is Dominik Teride. I'm here for the Konrad Adenauer Foundation. Unfortunately, Dr. Ostry couldn't be here today, but he sent his regards. I will now hand over to our great moderator, Dr. Borchardt, who is really an energy expert and legal expert on everything European Union. He holds many positions. He has lots of experience in the Commission. Especially the DG Commission, and he will now, without further ado, moderate this panel. Thank you very much for being here and for taking part.
Thank you very much, Damien. Also from my side, welcome to this event here. We are happy to have you here in the room, but also our participants online. The Net Zero Industry Act is still brand new, and we are happy to have a first in-depth discussion of it. I'm very happy to have a very well-chosen panel here. To my left is Dr. Konrad Adenauer. He is a member of the European Parliament, and he is a rapporteur for the Net Zero Industry Act. And it will be very interesting to hear from him where he sees some improvements or necessity for improvements and complementary elements to the Commission's proposal. We have then further on Camille Maury. Camille is the Senior Policy Officer at WWF Europe. And also, Camille, it will be very interesting to hear from your point of view whether this Net Zero Industry Act goes into the right direction or maybe even in the wrong direction. And then we have Dr. Bernd Weber. He is the CEO of EPICO KlimaInnovation. And from Bernd, we can expect the objective view. So what should be in the act as such? It is a pity, I must say, that we do not have anybody from the European Commission here, because it would have been good to hear from Commission representatives kind of summary what is behind this proposal, and also maybe the key elements of this proposal. So unfortunately, we were not able to get hold of one representative of the Commission. So we can only regret that. So I will do my best to do a short summary of what is in this Net Zero Industry Act. To start with, I think we have to bear in mind that this proposal has two key purposes. The first, of course, is that the European Union thinks that it has to react to the strategic challenge to ensure that the European Union has sufficient manufacturing capacity for strategic technology sectors, which are key if we want to complete and to achieve the Green Deal. We have seen in the past what has happened with the photovoltaic situation, where Europe for a long time was the leader in the manufacturing of the solar panels. But this has moved out mainly to China. And when you look at China, you can see that investments there are very strong in the wind sector and also electrolyzers. And shall we now fear that the same as with the solar panels, will happen also in these areas of manufacturing. The second purpose of this is to react to what mainly has happened in the United States with the US Inflation Reduction Act. This act grants massive subsidies also exactly to these important and strategic technologies in a very, very simple manner, as the Americans always do. They just do it with a budget. They just put the money to the project, and here even with tax credits that are tradable. In contrast, what the European Union is doing, we are not having this simple way of doing things, but we are going through the regulatory way, the incentive way, and funding way as such. So therefore, also, this proposal of the Net Zero Industry Act has to be seen together with the state aid guidelines on the temporary crisis and transition framework. This goes together because one cannot go without the other, because you need, of course, in order to establish what is in the Net Zero Industry Act, you need also the necessary funding, and therefore one had to relax the state aid provisions and the guidelines attached to it. Now, just very briefly, what are the, for me, the three key elements in this proposal of the Commission? First of all, this proposal distinguishes two sets of technologies. First, the strategic net zero technologies with specific mentions of photovoltaic, wind, heat pumps, batteries and electrolyzers, carbon capture and storage, grid technologies, and sustainable biogas and biomethane. Here, the Act foresees even, let's say, a headline target that 40% of the deployment of these technologies should be manufactured in the European Union. And then that's the global target for the strategic net zero technologies. And then you have specific targets for each individual technology that I have mentioned. If you have now a concrete investment project, you can request the recognition as a net zero strategic project by the member states. And if you get this recognition, this comes with quite some advantages. First, you get a preferential treatment in competitive bidding processes, so public tenders or renewable auctions, compared to the non-related projects. So it's really a preference given in the procurement. You have additional compensation mechanisms. You have a priority status, which means that your project is recognized as being in the public interest. And if it is in the public interest, there are a lot of other elements and advantages that are attached to that. You have a clear accelerated permitting. The Act says that you should have only 12 months for facilities which produce more than 1 gigawatt, and 9 months for those producing less than 1 gigawatt. So it's very precise, fixed in the Act, how long a permitting process should take. And then you have accelerated implementation and coordination of financing. So this is for the strategic net zero technologies. Then you have the net zero technologies. They are not strategic, but this concept of net zero technology comprises all the strategic technologies, and you can add to them the carbon capture and usage, not only the storage, but also the usage, so the industrial side of it, and the advanced nuclear technologies and the small modular reactors. This is the concept of the net zero technologies. And for these technologies, you also have very concrete benefits that are attached to this label if you are recognized as such. There you have a one-stop shop for the permitting. You do not have to go to different authorities. All is bundled in one. You have also an accelerated permitting. Here it is 12 months for projects with yearly manufacturing capacity of less than 1 gigawatt, and 18 months for projects for more than 1 gigawatts. You also have a streamlined approach to environmental impact assessments and planning. And here this is an interesting movement, because what the Act foresees is that the necessary environmental assessments and authorizations should be bundled, so that you also do it in one go and not split up in many different individual procedures. And the last, third and last aspect that I would like to mention is a proposal that concerns, again, the carbon capture and storage, CCS. Here, in essence, what the Commission proposes is that the oil and gas companies who are holding within the European Union a license for exploration and production, and who have produced during 2020 and 2023, for them, there is an obligation to invest in storage, CO2 storage capacity for 50 million tons. And this is an obligation that is put on the companies. And how is that done? It is pro rata to the level of the production during the 3 years period. That's the reference period. And the more you have produced during this period, the more of storage capacity you have to invest to. There are a lot of details which are critical, and maybe in the discussions we can, if it's of interest, we can explore this a bit further. For me, these are the three main venues that this proposal of the Commission opens. And we will now see how our panelists are looking at this proposal of the European Commission. And then I hope that we will have an open and interesting discussion. For those who are joining us online, you can leave your comments or questions in the chat box, and Domian will then take them up and put them here into our audience. So now I would like to start with Christian Ehler. He is the rapporteur. He is now the chef of the orchestra of this proposal, at least in the European Parliament. And I'm really looking forward to hear from you what your thoughts about these proposals are, and maybe also what is lacking and what you would like to complement, and how you see the work, the future work on this proposal. Christian Ehler, please.
Thank you very much for having me and in your afternoon. I mean, in general terms, I think it's important to understand where we are. We're at the end of a term of a commission. And I think personally that is the first proposal which shows that if you see politics as the swing of the pendulum over time, we are at the very moment at the top of the swing of the pendulum in one direction. I think the benefit of that commission is that they had been delivering on the Fit for 55 package in difficult times. Corona related to that a new dimension in terms of global competition. I would personally say that we at least come to a certain stop of that ever more globalized economies. We have new competitors, which are very strategic, geopolitical, and not necessarily economic agenda, or economic agenda to the advantage of their national or political interests. And I think that the Net Zero Act is somehow the bridging document to some extent from one commission to the next. You're going to see more or less that this is the part of the agenda for the next commission. So looking back to what we reflect to some extent, the IRA, I mean, necessarily the Net Zero Act can't be a reflection of the IRA. Simply, I mean, sometimes we overestimate a little bit the IRA. If you look to the relatively, let's say, stuck political system in the United States, the only thing which is available in this budget reconciliation, and the IRA, if you see that, I've been in the United States, and it's not so much perceived as an enabling instrument for clean tech or whatsoever. It is perceived as a corporate tax reform, basically. But as Mr. Borchert had been rightly saying, that is a very American approach, robust approach to incentivize, let's say, production. And I think it's a positive signal because it's the first signal that we are able to globalize the efforts in terms of CO2 reduction beyond conferences and setting goals. It's the first of the other three economic powers globally who is engaging by that. Personally, and that makes it so interesting, I personally believe that the agenda of the Biden administration is not so much just on clean technologies. It is simply that the Americans seeking to reindustrialize America, and the Americans understood that they lost the capacity to produce because it had been outsourced for so many decades, also to the benefit of consumer prices. There are a lot of arguments, but still the American industry in general terms lost their capacity to produce. And the IRA is far beyond clean tech, one of a few other attempts to reindustrialize America, to get industry production back, to get jobs back to the United States, but also really the capacity to produce. And I think, so necessarily, if you see the scope of that, a Net Zero Act can't be an answer or a complete 100% reflection of the IRA. I think it's just that we politically, the IRA is reflecting the shortcomings of the Fit for 55 and the Green Deal so far. Because what we are lacking, and there are reasons for that, it's not just that we can simplify that and blame it is simply the regulatory approach and give tax credits, and that's much better. I mean, you can stipulate the tax credits and also bad investment. I mean, I wouldn't see why you would invest public money, for example, in conventional lithium-ion battery plants anymore. In 5 years from now, the market should have solved that and not public money. So the question is that, as it portrayed in the public, so tax-driven innovation and tax-driven investment, is it necessarily the right way? But I mean, what had been reflected by the IRA and why we are so challenged is simply that the IRA would, to some extent, for industry, create a business case for CO2 reduction. And that is the problem we are lacking, because we substantially don't have a business case for this transformative process of our industry. We have a lot of ambition, we have a lot of hope. But I mean, if you're a CEO and you transform your steel plant or you transform your chemical plant, you're going to invest literally billions, and usually your stakeholders would ask you in terms of investment, what are the prices for energy? What are the prices for hydrogen? If you want to substitute hydrogen in combustion by carbon by hydrogen, and you would look in perspective, what is the cost then from our products and where's the market? And this is a question nobody can answer yet. The perception is that there will be a market uptake, but in practical terms, in economic terms, for a CEO, there isn't an answer yet. And what happens in the United States is, although that might be not sustainable per se, but with this tax credits, you have a relatively simplistic idea what is your business case, because it's heavily subsidized by tax cuts. So in a way, I think we shouldn't stare so much on the IRA. I think that the IRA, it depends a little bit what is your ambition towards that. If it's really CO2 reduction, the IRA isn't an ideal model, because what the Americans can't do, they don't have any kind of regulatory framework for that. There is no way that the stock system between the two big political parties are able to create a framework for that. But what they had been able in the budget reconciliation process had been able to make an agreement on the top corporate tax reform. So the question is, should we by a Net Zero Act necessarily copy paste reflect somehow IRA? And I would say no. But the reason why we do the Net Zero Act is because we see for the first time that there will be a global competitor which found a way that it seems to be plausible that there is a business case for CO2-free industry production. So, and that helps a little bit, from my point of view, to understand the perspective of the Net Zero Act. And the Net Zero Act and the shortcomings, and I start with the shortcomings because actually the Parliament had been applauding that. I think it's the step in the right direction. But the shortcoming had been exactly this kind of relatively narrow attempt to copy-paste at least partly the IRA, because it's focused on clean technologies. And that had been the pretension so far, because as if the IRA would be somehow challenging us in terms of clean technologies, the IRA is challenging us in terms of competitiveness. So the question is the Net Zero Act in its recent form, and Mr. Borchert had been portraying the benefits, which are without any doubt there. But is it actually what is needed? And so there starts a little bit the liar's poker also in the proposal. Because from my point of view, the basic question for Europe is not so much whether we reflect IRA or whether we have a challenge with clean technologies in competition with the Americans. The challenge is, what is the business case for a net zero economy in Europe? And so from my point of view, we jump too short. This relatively humble list of technologies, and then adding a little bit the idea of supply chain or value chain in terms of components as it is written in the proposal, doesn't reflect, I think, what's needed. So my proposal gets rid of that idea that we have a first, a second, or a third class of clean technologies. I think what we have to have a focus on, and that is the potential of the Act, is to strengthen the business case for net zero products in Europe. So what I've been done is, instead of creating these two classes of technologies and this relatively humble understanding of supply chain, I've broadened the perspective, also in terms of methodology. And I added it. There were two references possibly available. One was the taxonomy, and there just the reference to, let's say, the technologies, which is much broader and has a better understanding in terms of value chain and supply chain. Or it would have been the TCFL. That's the other list existing. That's the big budget junk we had been throwing on the member states. So I don't think it's even systematically or from a methodological point plausible to create three classes of technologies with different kind of funding. So what I had been trying is simply to get rid of this list, the annex, and look really to the supply chain and the value chain of products. And I give you a simple example. If you look to PV panels, the idea that you would produce PV panels is heavily dependent, and this is just an example, but on one company in Europe, and that's Wacker Chemie in Burghausen, producing 40% of the polysiliciums you need for PV panels. If Wacker is not flourishing in this supply chain, you're never going to see a PV panel. And also a more defensive description of what is the ambition as it had been chosen by the Commission, saying 40% should be produced in Europe. I don't believe in protectionistic measures, even indirectly with procurement. So I changed the perspective of that proposal, as we had been doing that, by the way, also systematically consistent with the CHIPS Act. I looked to the global market, and I said we want to achieve 20% of the global market, because if we don't want to be dependent, I think protectionistic measures don't work. If we have deeply integrated market where we have 20% market share, I think the sovereignty idea, which is standing behind a little bit between the lines, is much better served than by this idea of somehow by procurement, in a way, have a defensive stand. Why is that connected to Wacker? Because if we mess up polysilicium production in Europe, and if you not broaden that, you can't produce PV panels. You simply can't. So if you don't look related to your ambition to the supply chain and the whole value chain, you might fail, because you might enable permitting for PV productions, but you don't have a basic chemical industry serving that product line, the supply chain. So that's the reason why I changed the proposal in that direction. I got rid of the list. I got rid of the annexes, because otherwise we have a lobby battle, which is in, which is out. Do we have first-class investment, second-class investment? Do we stimulate on the taxonomy private market investments with a different list than we do with the public funding available by the funds giving to the member states? And then we have a list from the Commission looking to the member states with a different or third class of technologies. So it's not a matter of the beauty of a proposal, it's simply a matter of a systematic and methodological dimension. So by that, I think we are addressing much more the more principled question: where is the business case? Do we really reflect the whole supply chain and the value chain of that? So in terms of permitting, I mean, let's be honest. I mean, what the Commission had been doing is a little bit what lawyers would be saying. It's an agreement to the disadvantage of a third party. So when the Commission is looking to the member states and looking for shorter permission times, if you look to the ambition formulated in very abstract terms, I mean, a lot of the member states, if not even the majority, could say we have permitting times in theory of 9 or 12 months. But in real terms, the problem is, the shortcomings is, the documentations needed for the private sectors to get this permitting takes so long that the permitting time might not be the biggest problem. Secondly, we do understand that the member states don't have the capacities to do so. We learned that right now in the Commission with state aid. I think not state aid is principally the question. It's simply that it takes 2 years to make a decision on state aid in the Commission on whether or not something is available or not. And then I politically don't believe in this concept of one fits all, because I don't think that the member states are able to scrap the environmental law and a lot of other proposals quite generally in the light of the upcoming negotiations. So I reintroduced the idea of the net zero valleys. This is not because I want to completely shift all the permitting or the grants or whatsoever to the valleys, but I think for industry and also for legal reasons, it might be much more plausible to have certain valleys where we reverse the permitting, where a member state or a region decides that in a certain regions, they create the permitting framework, the environmental framework, saying this is done. So that are the conditions we created for that. And then there's an effective way to shorten permitting. Because in principle terms, I doubt that we get a general agreement with member states on all of the territory in Europe to scrap or to really shorten dramatically the framework, because we will have a lot of law cases. And in practically every member state, you have in the law experimental clauses where you say for a time being with a temporary limit, with a limited of scope, you have an experimental clause, so you can try. So I think it's much more plausible that is taken up by the member states and we get a deal with the council, because generally the council pretty much saying of all member states, we're going to really take the axe on the regulatory framework, I personally doubt. Last issue, and then I come to the end. We are going to look on the funding. And you might have seen that the big fight in the parliament or also in the commission and the council so far had been this kind of white elephant in the room, and that was the sovereignty fund. I personally don't believe if we want to get that proposal working in that period, get a deal with the council, to draw a new financial instrument on the table has any plausibility. But on the other hand, to propose something of that dimension to have no funding is also not plausible. So what would be available? It's the existing funds. We had been bringing out innovation fund, the transformation funds for the crew regions. There would be a lot of things available, but if you see realistically in the council, the discussion is right now that the COVID fund should be prolonged to 2030. Let's see whether courts in Germany are going to digest that. But realistically, I think that the member states want to prolong the existing funds, and the realistic chance to really change or use them for that purpose, I personally doubt. So what is on the table, which you have to not to draw on the table artificially, and that's the ETS revenues. I mean, we have to be a little bit careful. It's a little bit like in the Bible at the lake in Nazareth, you know, you have 3 fish and a little bit of water, and then you feed the masses. But still, I mean, we had a solid look on with our budget people on that. 50% of the revenues are available. Most of them had been paid by industry anyway. So my proposal puts 25% of the revenues as a financial instrument for funding. And realistically, we're going to need that to build up production capacities in areas where there is no business case at first hand, or they're of strategical nature, as I had been referring to the silicon polymers. So in general terms, there are 3 messages. First of all, I think that this is the bridging document between this commission and the agenda of the next one. And it's very positive that we care about competitiveness for the first time, about business cases, about regulatory framework, the over-regulation. Secondly, I think the scope is too narrow, and it's a little bit too much looking to the United States, which is a pretension, and we should broaden the scope. As I have been referring to supply chain and other issues. And then in terms of permitting, I think we have to have a more clever idea than simply to ask the member states to get creative how to scrap in general terms their environmental regulatory framework. So I think that the net zero values might be an instrument where Parliament and where the Council and also the regions and the member states have an appetite to bring that forward, and really to substantially reduce then permitting times. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much indeed, Mr. Ehler, for this very interesting presentation and the ideas that you have put forward. I almost liked all of them, I must say. But I think then you still have to rewrite the proposal almost from
I did. It's
yes.
there. It's published.
In one of your 3 concluding principles, you have mentioned the competitiveness that will dominate also the next commission. And that brings me to our next speaker, Camille. Camille, it's Mr. Ehler says now this is now competitiveness, and when we were in the deep crisis with the Russian invasion of Ukraine, all of a sudden we had a security of supply problem. So we focused on how to tackle the security of supply in the energy sector. Now we are coming with this act, as Mr. Ehler rightly said, the competitiveness of the industry. Where in all this is the sustainability, which was always #1 of the 3 objectives. Is that now something that you feel is a bit put under the table, or do you see also in the proposal, and also what Mr. Ehler has just laid out as his ideas, do you see that the sustainability objective is still part of the three big objectives that the energy policy should achieve.
Yeah, thanks a lot. First of all, thanks a lot for the invitation and good afternoon, everyone. I'm delighted to be here. It's nice to have a diverse panel on this topic. Actually, before I answer your point on whether I see this Net Zero Industry Act going into the right direction, whether there's like enough sustainability components, I would like to emphasize one point that maybe has not been said so far, is that also the Net Zero Industry Act aim at boosting the EU resilience and competitiveness. We all agree on that point, but the overall intended intention from the European Commission is actually to scale up manufacturing of clean technologies in order to achieve our 2030 emission targets. And I think this is very important to have in mind, that now we committed to a reduction of a greenhouse gas emission by 2030. And how to do that? Well, we have to boost certain type of key technologies to achieve what we committed to. And I think this is why the European Commission came out with this Green Deal Industrial Plan. And one of the components of the Green Deal Industrial Plan is this Net Zero Industry Act. So also something I really want to emphasize before I get into the different points I wanted to make is that when you talk about industrial policy, be it at national level, be it at European level, you really have to think here in a holistic way. Because at the moment, what we want to create is like the world we want to live in 2050, when we have achieved climate neutrality. And to do that, we have to have our environmental goals in mind, but also like the social issues. That's why at the moment, what is really missing is really to have, let's say, a holistic and open discussion with the different stakeholders when it comes to industrial policy. It's not only, industrial policy will not be made only by industrial actors, because it will be made also for the people. And I will come into that when we talk about the Net Zero Industry Valley. But I really wanted to emphasize that. The 4 points I would like to make here concern, first of all, the scope and the ambition of the Act, then the permitting and the deregulation approach, and then the governance, and finally, the financing. So if we start with the scope and the ambition, it is actually welcome that we have such regulation, if it's really focused on the right scope. At the moment, if we really want to achieve the 2030 emission target that the EU has set up and committed to, we really need to scale up some key technologies. And here I'm thinking of technologies which are linked to solar panel deployment, wind turbines, so everything to scale up the renewable, because we need renewables at a massive scale at the moment. And also renewable hydrogen, but for targeted sector, I'm really thinking, for instance, of the steel and cement industry, where steel, cement, mostly chemical as well, where we will need renewable hydrogen. So for that, we need to actually produce much more electrolyzers in the EU. And why in the EU? I think that was very well explained by both of you just before, because at the moment we are like in a crisis which comes even like from before the COVID-19 crisis, is that actually we had like we are highly dependent on third country, which is China, when it comes to most of our like solar PVs. And also right now with electrolyzers, the EU is trying to compete of where and when it would be like easier and cheaper to produce electrolyzers. So I think this is just like the scope is very, very much important. What's missing in this act as well from the like what has been proposed by the Commission and what we don't see right now proposed by the European Parliament is also a measure to actually really tackle also energy efficiency at the core, like everything which is linked to recycling measure, circularity is not even mentioned. And this is actually a big thing in terms of how we want to achieve also our 2030 emission reduction targets. So I would say that the scope really needs to be in everyone's mind. And that's why we're very surprised as an environmental NGO to see CCS portrayed here, because you cannot put carbon capture and storage on an equal footing with renewables when it comes to how much like solar PVs and also like wind turbines we will need, because CCS, in our views, it's really like a technology that will have a future, but not for 2030. It will be like for beyond, so to achieve our climate neutrality in 2050, and also very limited to targeted sector. Here I'm thinking of lime and cement, and for unavoidable emission like CO2 emission that really are really difficult to abate. So putting like a full chapter on carbon capture and storage was a bit surprising, but as MEPLR mentioned, this is an act which is like, let's say, making a bridge between this commission and the new commission. So maybe because we are in such an hurry in terms of legislative proposal, because we are 1 year before the term of this commission, maybe that's why CCS is so prominent here. At least that would be like my thinking behind, because we were a bit puzzled. And also just to mention that there was no impact assessment on this CO2 storage capacity. So it's a bit questionable. Why do we need 15 million tons by 2030 in terms of CO2 storage? Well, it would be great to have an answer from the Commission on that point. When it comes to permitting and deregulation approach, and I will actually try also to tackle the net zero industry valleys. I think here it's quite interesting that we have this idea of we really need to cut the permitting time frame, and that we need to scrap environmental law in a way. I think that actually is the opposite. We really need to tackle maybe the time frame for permitting, but here again, the Commission comes with this idea that for any type of manufacturing industry, it takes between 2 and 7 years to get a permit. There was no really explanation for what type of manufacturing industry. Are we talking about batteries? Are we talking about solar PVs? Are we talking about electrolyzers? I imagine that it really differs. So again, an impact assessment would have been good to understand exactly on permitting what was the issue. When it comes to permitting, you have also, let's say, a better approach than maybe just scrapping the timeline based on non-real data. It will be really to look at spatial planning, to include the local population, and really imagine in a way the promoter taking on board, let's say, the public and the population in order to have its project approved. I have in mind an example, which is H2 Green Steel in Sweden, which just managed to have actually, its big project approved. It took them 1.5 years, and it was happening because actually they made a lot of communication, they talked to the local population. So I think it's here we really have to think in another way how we want to achieve things, because if we don't take into account civil society organization and also the local communities, well, we could have quite a backlash in terms of acceptance when it comes to this green transition. And it's really nothing you want to have. At least that's not the word I imagine, or the word I want to live, where actually society is not embracing and accepting the transition. So when it comes to the net zero industry value, I understand that this is a proposal that was already in the Commission draft proposal, but it has been put out. Then it is now coming back with your proposal from the European Parliament, both in ITRE committee and also in ENVI committee. So here, at least, I think you have quite a similar views on this idea of identifying, let's say, areas where we could have manufacturing industry. If this idea is here to stay, I would like to make some recommendation, like to imagine it in a way that it's designed in the best possible way. So, I mean, we all have in mind, let's say areas which have been disindustrialized. I personally come from a region which is Lorraine in France, which was heavily disindustrialized. We used to have a lot of coal mines before. So the idea would be like, why we don't look at brownfield areas which have been heavily disindustrialized. We do it with the local population and we identify what could be done there. But really, if there is one thing that we should not do is to touch Natura 2000 sites in order to actually build manufacturing infrastructures. At the moment, this would be very damageable because our ecosystems are also helping us in this transition. So we should really look at which are the regions together with the member states and maybe the support from the European Commission, because we don't want to put all the burden on the member states at the moment. And also this idea that you need only one environmental impact assessment within those net zero industry valley will be quite damageable. I think it really depends on which type of technologies and which type of manufacturing industry you want to build in those net zero industry valleys. And for that, you need maybe more than one, I think even more, than one or two environmental impact assessments. So actually, as you see, it's really holistic. It comes back to the world you want to build tomorrow. And for that, I go back to the governance approach. When we think of new platform, like the net zero industry platform, I think it's really important to have in mind that you really won't have this scale up of clean technologies if you don't have the public on board. It's the same with the Critical Raw Material Act. I think you really need to have this approach to really consult the public, because those are the people that will be the most affected. If tomorrow you have a solar PV manufacturing industry next to you that provide good and quality jobs, that's maybe great for your future. But if you have let's say the thing of creating a nuclear reactor next to your place, maybe that raise other concerns. So again, for those net zero industry valleys, it will be really important to have the consultation of the public. When it comes to the financing, here again, I find that very interesting because the Green Deal Industrial Plan, that was the answer to the net zero, to the IRA, to the US Inflation Reduction Act. The Commission made it quite clear that in its answer, it had different pillars. You have the Net Zero Industry Act, which is supposed to scale up clean technologies and look at permitting issue. So how we can faster permitting, but without scrapping environmental laws. Then you have this idea of coming up with a sovereignty fund. Of course, it will be very difficult because we know that we have frugal countries, but it's not impossible, and the European Commission will make a proposal. So you have different pillars as the component of the answer to the US IRA. So touching on the ETS revenue from member states, that's an approach that needs to be actually tackled carefully for several reasons, and I will try to explain those. Last year, actually, we were really involved as WWF in the ETS, so the emission trading system revision. And we published a report which was called "Where Did All the Money Go?" And I invite all of you to go and have a look, where actually we look at the ETS revenue made per member states. And of course, we were quite supportive of this idea of having 100% of the ETS revenue used for climate action. That was one of our recommendations for, I think, 4 years, because we have been issuing this ETS revenue report for the last 4 years. And we were quite happy to see that happening through trilogue negotiation and member states actually agreeing with that, which was not an easy task. But then you have to be careful of what is the climate action? What do you want to finance with this ETS revenue? Because at the moment, if you look at what it is financing, you have a lot of everything. So you don't have a clear definition of what is clean and really green and what will help us to achieve this transition. So maybe the answer is not to put all of the ETS revenue into CCS technologies, because this will actually lock us into fossil fuel dependency for even a longer time. So when it comes to Net Zero Industry Act and this idea of using, if I'm not mistaken, is 25% of the ETS revenue in order to finance this Net Zero Industry Act, or at least those technologies that would have been identified, I think here again, it could be maybe discussed if it's really clean and green technologies. But if the scope is so broad that inside we have so many technologies that are actually not helpful to reach the 2030 target and could be even harmful because it will actually lock us even more into fossil fuels, then it could be quite questionable. So yeah, just to conclude, I just tried to portray you, let's say, the vision of industrial policy that we would like to see, more of an holistic one, tackling the 2030 targets as much as the climate neutrality targets, and at the same time trying to be more inclusive and having on board like different stakeholders. And I will stop here.
Thank you very much, Camille. Also very interesting statements, and also very nicely focused on the 4 issues. We will come back to that. Thank you. Bernd, last but not least, I have introduced you. Climate innovation. What is your take on the proposal, and maybe also what you have already heard so far?
Yeah, thank you very much. I will start with what we all can agree on, which is that we need to find a suitable response to the new industrial policy, so to say, from leading economies. And at the same time, we also need, as Europe, to find our place, probably also our pace in the race for clean tech. And I think the right approach to respond to this is indeed to continue writing the story of the Green Deal, but to also complement it. And so the basic idea behind the Net Zero Industry Act is right. However, I think it delivers short on what we actually need, which is a comprehensive industry strategy, which it is not. And this industry strategy needs to deliver on our climate and our sustainability ambition. I totally agree with that. It also needs to provide you with a competitive edge on clean tech manufacturing, so that's also correct. But at the same time, it also needs to provide Europe with a competitive edge in terms of being an industrial location for climate-friendly or even carbon-free industrial production instead of this big deindustrialization. And I think it's understandable why it does not live up to this ambition, because it was compiled rather hastily. But the point that I would like to make is that we need to think about this industrial agenda, which we need in a more structured way, in the sense that we need guiding principles. I would say guiding principles of social and ecological market economy. And I would like to suggest in my statement 3 venues of improvement. First one is to render the Net Zero Industry Act more comprehensive as an industrial agenda, partly picking up on what Mr. Eder said before, render it more efficient in terms of financing, and maybe a bit counterintuitive, render it more European than it actually is. So let me start with the first one. Render it more comprehensive. And what we see in the Net Zero Industry Act, and I agree with Mr. Eder on that, is a rather narrow focus on scaling up clean tech manufacturing, which is good and which is right. At the same time, we are missing the deployment of this technology, and we are also missing the support that we need for transformation of heavy industry, of energy intensive industry. So we're basically missing a large part of the value chain or of industrial activity. Now, as it was said before, it seems that the Net Zero Industry Act is kind of the bridge between this commission and the next. So I'm not sure whether this is the right place to address it, or another proposal is the right way to address it, but we definitely need to address it. We cannot leave that out. Then taking this rather industrial perspective, I would actually disagree with Camille. I think that what we've seen on CCUS is actually good, especially for the hard-to-abate sectors in the industry, which very much need carbon capture and storage and also utilization. However, I think here again, the proposal is not comprehensive. We do have a target for the storage capacity, which is good, kind of starting at the end of the CCUS value chain, if you want. But we do not have a target for transport. And this is so, for example, transport and also for the capture. So these parts are missing. Another point that I think where the Net Zero Industry Act maybe is not seizing the full potential is indeed green public procurement, because simply because the potential here is so huge. If you think of public procurement that accounts for 40% of the EU GDP, it's massive, and we should use that, in my view, in a more strategic way to support technologies and products, especially with a circular perspective. So I think here is something from a market perspective, or rather a perspective to establish lead markets, which we should use and which we could improve. Brings me to the second venue of improvement, which is render it more efficient. So what do I mean by that? I completely echo what was said before. We should, take the existing financing instruments and make them more simple, more accessible, and more coordinated. I also agree with the political analysis that this might be not enough, that we need additional funds. And I think what I would see to be not reflected enough in the Net Zero Industry Act is that it should be really about incentivizing and enabling private investment, because this is the key driver that we need. It cannot be public investment. Public investment can play a role in leveraging private investment, but it does not solve the issue here, because what we see in terms of the CO2 reduction gap that we have is that it's mirrored by an investment gap. And this is actually key framework condition for the Net Zero Industry Act to deliver. So it's really important to think about it. So interlinkage between sustainable finance and this industrial agenda perspective. And here I would suggest to look closer into blended finance, because I think it provides us with a possibility to de-risk investments, to also tackle the first mover disadvantage, and to reduce market risks in the short and medium term, and in general to have more equity, to have more capital flow into innovation. However, I think here we also need to have a clear focus. And this focus, in my view, should be the gaps in the current funding landscape. We already have a lot of funding, so we should not just replicate everything, but we should focus. And here I would say focus on a certain technology readiness level, a level which has already left the laboratory scale, so to say. And we should also focus on small and medium-sized enterprises, which are really in need for this financing support, which feature the most relevant financing gap here, in my view. And this brings me, last but not least, to the third venue of improvement, render everything more European, and I will also add more international at the same time. So when I look at the current funding pillar that we have, it's basically based on state aid, increasing state aid ceilings, which is great for big member states or wealthy member states, France, Germany. That's good, but it's actually not good for other member states, and it risks of fragmenting or even leading us to different decarbonization speeds, if you want. And this problem is also mirrored by the IPCEI, and we don't want to end up in a position where we basically create an architecture for a future cohesion policy due to this different decarbonization speed. So I think we need to support the member states, which are not the big ones, not the wealthiest ones, and also to get a piece of the cake, and probably also support their administrative capacities in particular, so they can actually absorb the funds, which is a competitive disadvantage which they currently have. And last but not least, let me add that I also think that the Net Zero Industry Act has to become more international. When I look at the Critical Raw Materials Act, there the idea of having partnerships is quite prominent. Net Zero Industry Act is rather silent on that, but I think if we think of decarbonization of the industry, we really need to think also about international cooperation. And I think one good entry point for this is actually the G7 proposal on climate finance. If we would manage to collaborate with third countries on such on with a sectoral perspective, for example, on hydrogen or on steel, and define a common agenda, define common instruments, define common standards, it can benefit third countries, it can benefit us here in Europe, and in general, it can help us to ramp up these technologies that we definitely need. Yeah, thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you, Bernd. Also, very nice that you have just focused on what is lacking in the proposal. What I can say already, having listened to all of you, there's still a lot of work to be done in order to get it right. But before I start the panel discussion, I would like to ask you, do you have already a question or remark that you want to put to the panelists? And then, is there something online already? Oh, I see. We have one here. Please, would you introduce yourself and then ask your question?
Sure, many thanks. I'm Konrad Adenauer, been part of the CAS family for the past 20 years. I also advised the late Prime Minister and President of the EPP, Dr. Martens, and now I work as an energy consultant. So I have one comment and a question, if that's okay. Quick comment just to convene on the CCS and why it's in the Net Zero Industry Act. I think that in your analysis, you actually reached the conclusion, because it is something that we need for the net zero, which is 2050 target. And those projects take forever to actually roll out and get in place. And they also necessitate quite a lot of infrastructure and the market to be functional. So I think that might be one of the elements. I have a question for Mr. Eller, because I do subscribe to the school of let the markets play as much as possible and determine who are the winners. So I like the approach of scrapping these are technologies. This is how we should approach it. One thing that also in discussion with colleagues who work on both sides of the Atlantic, comparing the IRA and Net Zero, we came to the conclusion that the mandates which are on some of the technologies might also be counterproductive. Namely, if we link production of one thing to the need to invest in another thing, that could lead to disinvestments in certain critical sectors. And what we learned from the NATO in the past several months, because we work quite closely on the potential for further escalation, is that those are the industries that we will strategically need in Europe, not for a very long time, but for the immediate future. It is something that would be critical to maintain. So I'm curious to hear your thoughts on this approach of targets on one side and then mandates on the other side.
I would start with you, because that was a question, and the CCS I wanted to raise myself, so we will come back to that.
I mean, I take up what you had been saying, that I trust much more in the market. And I think that is what you had been portraying has a certain plausibility, but also dangers in itself. Because yet again, this is some kind of intervention in the market. But in principle terms, the problem is that we don't understand, and that's why I'm getting so nervous with the word holistic. I'm coming from industry. I've built up production plants, production lines, and so. And there's a holistic perception of my sector, but there's a strictly vertical supply chain and value chain. And from my point of view, the shortcoming of all that discussion is, first of all, we talk already about net zero industries in principle terms. But the simplistic question now is, we had been fairly holistic. The whole Fit for 55 is a holistic approach. None of it had been concerning vertical value chain, supply chain whatsoever. So the task now is, in not even 7 years, how to deliver. So what I see in the industry is simply they're counting backwards from 2030. If I'm a CEO right now, I have to decide what I'm going to do. And I have to invest practically this year or the next year in order to achieve something in 2030. So what I see, and I think that's very much the shortcoming of your argumentation, is this idea, yeah, we look on certain technology, or we would have an understanding what is strategical or whatsoever. The problem is, I mean, if you see PV panels, the problem is it's not that we want PV panels will make PV panels. It's simply the question whether we have left in Europe, by a growing demand globally, our own capacities to produce polysilicons. If we don't have, we're going to buy that from China. And all this kind of procurement measures and so will be empty. Because either you want to have clean energy, then you need PV as a technology, but you're going to have it if you have the value chain. So this proposal, and it's not the time for permanently referring to holistic. Everything was holistic now for a decade. The proposal, that the question is, counting back from 2030, what capacity of PV production you want to have? What is the supply chain to that? What is the value chain? And to what extent the Net Zero Act is contributing to that or not? So what it does, and there is a matrix much more helping than holistic, you have to have a matrix, simply a matrix approach. If you say, okay, we have 5 technology, even I would identify them, then I would have to look on the supply chain. And then I would say, what do I have to enable or make sure that we are going to produce in Europe, producing faster, more, and to some extent with an economic plausibility in order to achieve 2030. I think that's not question 2030. So, and if you put a matrix on that, and I'm a poor economist, I would simply put the matrix. I had a sectoral perspective, then I put the matrix on the instruments on that, and it doesn't work. Because it doesn't address the very question, where do we have basic chemical production, which is needed. Second aspect for the same PV panel is the shortcomings are chips. The basic question whether we're going to produce is yet again looking to polysilicones. And we have a market share globally of 8% left. On the PV panel basic chemical production, we have at least a market share of 40% in our own market. Globally, it's less than 20. So realistically, if you look to this vertical supply chain and the vertical value chain, the question is that addressing that or not? And we talk about 7 years. We don't talk about 40 with CCS, by the way. I'm coming from my constituency. We have steel plants, we have chemical industry, and we have cement. Practically 80% of the cement of Berlin will be produced by one company in Brandenburg. So CEMEX simply says either this will be the first CO2 produced cement in Europe, and we are going to invest 1 billion euro. But then you have to have a solution to the 2030 where you get the CCS2, an infrastructure, a cost idea, a regulatory framework, or we're not going to produce that. Then you could say, okay, we have projects that will need cement. So in a way, it becomes clear now that this kind of holistic approach, this kind of intermediate, what we might need or might not need or so, just look for the first time in this discussion to the supply chain and to value chain. And you can answer literally whether we are going to have that or we are not going to have that, and whether an instrument is feasible for that or not. And if it's addressing just a very few, for example, PV production, we're not going to produce PV if we don't have polysilicons in Europe produced. So that is, I think, the shortcoming of discussion, reflected a little bit what you said. I mean, there's a plausibility, but it's also very technical. I think right now we have really an economic idea. The perception is 55% CO2 reduction, and we need a business case for that. Otherwise, it's not going to produce in Europe simply. And that gives you an answer of what is plausible and not so plausible here. And the last sentence when you said, and I'm very favorable because I went through that because I was introducing plans or building up plans and went through that procedure. I mean, yes, we refer to this societal acceptance, but you can't hide away from the conflicting goals. I had recently the Prime Minister of Baden-Württemberg. Baden-Württemberg now for 1.5 terms wants to have pump storage. We need pump storage. We need to store electrification. There is none built, a single one built in Baden-Württemberg, because the same political party which is ruling Baden-Württemberg is opposed regionally by their same people saying, we don't want to have that. And at a certain point, we have to be honest. It doesn't work if we don't build transmission line, if we don't take about storage, and we will get in conflicting goals. And you can't pretend that you permanently, by addressing holistic concerns, that the very fact that if we want to achieve 2030 and we shy away to decide if there are conflicting goals, what we're going to do. Do we do environmental law? And there is reason to say in my lake, in my Mar in Baden-Württemberg, I don't want to have that. Or you don't have the storage infrastructure you need for renewables. And these conflicting goals you can't muddle through saying in a proposal like that, which is meant to deliver on the deliveries for the first time, saying, oh, let's have a holistic perception and so on. So, I mean, obviously, you don't do that against your population, but obviously, if your population doesn't want, you can't hide away and pretty much have to explain that there are conflicting goals and you might have to decide in one direction in order to achieve that, or you're not going to achieve anything.
Camille, I'll come to your question in a minute. Question to you. Are you convinced what you just heard from Mr. Ehler and what you have heard from Bernd and also already from the audience that your view is too narrow when it comes to the scope, that you are identifying only, and I think you are even reducing the scope of the Commission proposal further, that you just want to highlight 2 or 3 key technologies, clean technologies. Are you not convinced that what Mr. Ehler just said, that it's nice to have a holistic approach that leads us to the targets, but at a certain moment you have to implement this and to make it happen? And is there not a lot of truth in it when you then have to take a value chain approach, which includes, of course, the usage of specific technologies? It's not that it is left outside, but it is an integral part of a much broader scope that is needed if you want to do, also I pick up what Bernd said, if you want to really achieve industrial strategy. You cannot do that just by picking some key clean technologies. You really need to go through the value chain, and taking the chain as such would also, in my view, pick up what you yourself said on the efficiency side, that the circular economy, all this goes into chain logic and less picking some technologies. So my question is, are you now convinced on this point of the scope, or do you believe that we have to remain holistic and then see that the nice targets of 2030 will fall from the sky?
No, thanks for the question. But I must say that I didn't come here to be convinced. I came here for having a discussion, which is fine as well. I think we can agree to disagree. I mean, you know, that's fine. I have no problem with that. So, I mean, I understand the points which were raised on this idea of taking the whole value chain. And in a way, I think it's funny also that we talk about this act, we don't talk so much about the Critical Raw Material Act, and I think they are also linked to some extent. And maybe we should have also mentioned that in our intervention, but we try to have only this focus on the Net Zero Industry Act, which also it would have been great to have someone from the European Commission, because from what I understand, this act has been drafted in a hurry compared to the Critical Raw Material Act, which has like much more thought have been put into that. So when you tackle the international dimension, I think it has been in the Commission, let's say, you know, I wanted to say DGs for a longer time as the Net Zero Industry Act. What I wanted to say when I say that we should have a holistic approach, it's because it's exactly what we should not have, what you mentioned, the case that you mentioned. We should not have a population saying, I don't want that. So we should embark it in order to actually have the deployment of the technologies that we need to achieve the 2030 targets. Like in mind, I have the example of Spain right now. Like I think we all saw that there was a lot of public concern raised with the deployment of renewables, and it's only renewables. It's not only technology that we could actually, you know, be having like a stronger feeling about it. You know, like building a nuclear reactor or something like that. So, I mean, even in Spain, like we have with REPowerEU and this idea of deployment of renewables, now we have a lot of public backlash. So what should we do? We should ignore those. I mean, at some point, it's not gonna help anyone, you know? So in a way, if you have, that's why I refer to holistic, but it can be more inclusive. I mean, we can choose another term, but this idea of having like every part of society involved will help also to create like this climate neutral world that we want. And in order to have people also working in those companies, if you actually mention to them that those are like, you know, well-paid jobs in an industry, in a place that actually has been heavily disindustrialized for so many years, I'm sure those people will be actually happy to come and work for this company. So in a way, it's all about, communicating about it and being more, let's say, inclusive, let's say, and about the strategic approach versus being more open to modern technologies. I guess here we will not manage to agree. And let's put it that way. And I think it's fine because, you know, the world is made of many colors and that's perfect. That's why we are here. So we will not agree because when I hear about CCS and how much we should invest into that for 2050, I understand CCS will play a role. And I don't want to say that even coming from an NGO, that we won't be able to recognize that CCS will play a role. I think we are trying at the moment to have a lot of discussion in order to understand what our view of CCS is. It's just that it's like renewable hydrogen. It will play a role, but for targeted sector. So we have to be careful in terms of the investment. So I think I will stop here because maybe there is also.
Yeah, I have to look at we have three, and I will take all the three, and then all three can answer. You were the first.
Yes, thank you. I think we had a wonderful integration of the ETS. And hence, I would like to come back to the points on the ETS review. And implement policies review will be dedicated to finance the NZIA. And hence, I would have my question concerns the stages. This is a channeling channel. Do you mean earmarking 25% of the Egypt revenues to local technology, CTS, or what's happening? Which is part of the sustainability. Yes, all you actually need pushing forward for planning 25% of the revenues are on resources. In which case, I guess it would also make sense that we each apply the regulation of the ETS, broader regulation.
I take the other two questions, Susanne.
Yeah, also a question to Mr. Ehler, Susanna Rocken representing E.ON. It's a very complete question actually on permitting. You are introducing the ambition to reduce the administrative burden in terms of permitting and taking as a reference point the cost of doing business in Europe, if I understand it correctly. So my question or my doubt on this would be, wouldn't it be difficult to quantify it, or how do we intend to quantify it? And couldn't there be different baselines across Europe which might emerge? So that's one question. And if you have time to answer, I would be interested in knowing what do you consider now we will enter into the negotiations. You will talk to your shadows. So what are going from your point of view to be like the key difficult points across the political groups to find an agreement?
Yeah, I just wanted to we talked a bit about the critical role. Sorry, Ian Johnston, I'm a journalist at the National Times, about the Critical Raw Materials Act as well, and whether these two pieces of legislation can be linked in a more coherent way, and discussions ongoing in that sense. And then I think you mentioned, Sir, the moving the headline targets to the 40% of strategic technology to be manufactured in EU, if I understood correctly. With the IRA, are we not too far behind to catch up on that? We not need much broader scale investment to do that.
So there are three questions, and I add another one because I was interested because you were talking about the net zero valleys, and I like the approach that this could be a solution for the permitting, because I agree with you, just from EU level to put 12 or 9 or 18 months does not make sense. But my question there is, when you look at the net zero valleys, how do you define it? I mean, Camilla has made a proposal which I like very much to say. In the first place, it should be deindustrialized areas that should give the first chance in order to attract new production facilities. But how do you see then the determination, the selection of these, and who is doing that? Is that a regional thing? Is it a national thing? Or you leave it to the member states to decide that? Or should there not be a kind of guidance also from European side? A lot for you to say, but
so I try. I'm aware about the complexity of financing, but I mean, I have been already negotiating the Parliament's first reflection of the Commission communication. I'm one of the budget rapporteurs of the Parliament. I'm simply put that 3 resources available: new money, fresh money, that would be a new fund, whatever, sovereignty and so on. So I'm here for 20 years in the Parliament. I went last November through the painful process of nothing. In the end, the budget process. No way that before the European election there is any attempt, somehow just plausible, that we get a sovereignty fund. Just forget it. Whatever the Commission comes up, no way. So I'm not willing to engage that I'm an old horse. Might be that I'm an old white man, but I'm an old horse in politics, so I'm not engaging in fantasies. So the second thing which is available is the number of funds which had been available to the member states. There you see that they have a hard time to spend the money. There's an ongoing discussion of prolonging and whatsoever. So I don't see that realistically, that these funds which had been dedicated already to some extent, also not spent, we engage in a very complex discussion on reshuffling them and so on. So would be the plausible solution, whether it's available before the European elections and to be added to an instrument like that, no way. So leaves us more or less the revenues of the ETS. Realistically, we are talking not about own resources of the Union. Realistically, we are talking about making that available in the member states. Would be also plausible then in relation to the net zero values and a lot of things, because I don't think that right now the Commission has the capacities, nor the appetite, nor the ability right now to set up a new funding instrument and then set them deciding where and how to do that in member states. It's almost uncomparable. There will be even in terms of the value change, the problem you have is that you don't have even complete value change in all the member states. You have a value change along member states. So it might be very plausible that that in terms of the revenue, we talk about the member states. Yes, it's complex. But I mean, I'm not doing that after 20 years here in the parliament, not considering that together with our budget colleagues, also with Panellists, who have been the author of the ETS. Politically, that's the only thing with a potential. I wouldn't call it more, but I think it has a potential to be negotiated and finalized. The rest is simply out of the loop. But no own resources. I don't want to draw ETS revenues on the European level, too complicated and so on. So I think the compromise could be that the member states are earmarking the ETS revenue for that purposes. Then on the permitting. I mean, the permitting is an interesting political question because that is what I say, why it's bridging. So you have on the one hand the idea of permitting and also permitting is related to the regulatory burden. So the problem is we all say that, and then you might say, okay, that is a very abstract question. So you need, in order to systemize or to have a methodology for the reduction, any kind of reference for that. So I'm choosing the reference because I think it's needed for good regulation. There is in 2080s, that's the latest in the edition of the indicators of product market regulation. The OECD determined that all of the EU member states have a higher regulatory burden than the OECD benchmark before Fit for 55. So, I mean, you have to have, I mean, if you do a regulation, you have to have reference frames. You can't say we are overburdened. Then you would rightly say, I mean, this is very abstract and not a good line of argumentation. On permitting, it's very complex because the Commission stayed very vague and the member states could duck and cover and saying, okay, we have 9 months, we have 12 months. The question is, who is doing what and how long does it take? So is it that the member states are granting that permission in 9 or 12 months? Is it that it takes how long for industry to apply for that, given the regulatory framework for that? Is like, if you're honest, that we have a state aid problem in general terms with IPCEI, not because of the delicacy of the IPCEIs, it's simply that the Commission's resources are overrun by the 500 million projects from member states coming on state aid, the IPCEIs whatsoever. And in real terms, they have, I would say, 50 people who can run complex files like that. So in a way, the question is also the ability of the public sector in order to grant that. So while I'm reflecting, and I say that brutally, also a tacit case that will be negotiated, but at least we should envisage that. I mean, it won't be a general solution, but I mean, we have to have a starting point for the discussion. The other aspect is the announcement of the President of the Commission, who had been saying, I want to reduce, and then the fine-tuning is 25% of the documentation burden of the industry. So we always take it serious what the President of the Commission is saying in general speeches. So we try to link that, and you're going to see a lot of amendments on that. We try to link the permitting question to this question, because interestingly, the Commission so far didn't touch their part of the permitting. And then thirdly, on the this was financing, cost of doing business, and then the
Critical raw materials.
the critical raw materials. Yeah, sure. I mean, that is, we are already talking to our colleagues in the ENVI committee. I mean, that's a little bit, I mean, we are so used now over time because it's permitted between ITRE and the ENVI committee. So yes, I think there are links. The question is, was it meant and is it fit in terms of design? But we agreed internally in the parliament that we run these cases in parallel, so that we don't end up with the critical raw materials first and then with the other one. Deadline envisaged is the end of November. More or less, it must be parallel by that, because then it's not fast track technically seen, but it's fast practically seen. The interesting thing is that the problem we have is right now is the council, because the council had been, let's say, working on the critical raw materials, whereas on the Net Zero Act we are not having much. And I think what I also want to say, I mean, yes, it will become, obviously, as it is in times, an ideological challenge. But in practical terms, I'm much more interested in practical solutions. So we are still looking to the Commission, what the Commission is going to come in terms of the competitiveness instrument. That is, I'm going to amend also, because I want to have a Sevilla process and not a case-to-case kind of instrument. So that's what I'm saying. I mean, you're going to see that this is already a strange creature in terms of regulation from the Commission, because it's between a political statement, appellative to third member states. Will it have a financial instrument related to that? So it's already a kind of umbrella proposal. But I think that the discussion related to that, we would like to introduce much more processes like the Sevilla process, that we don't run into the situation that we case by case, based on, you had been asking for the impact assessment. I mean, the impact assessments, I'm an economist, I've been working on that. I mean, they're all a joke, because most of them are equilibrium models, because you want to get your math straight. If you, in a transition process, have an impact assessment, you have so many variables that you don't get your math straight. And I mean, that's principal algebra, and where you go to equilibrium models, because you set some of the variables straight for 10 years, and then you get something out of that. So I personally doubt that in transformation phases, this kind of case impact assessments are not a liar's poker, because the Commission gets some kind of model which somehow mathematically works, but the question is whether that tells you something. The Parliament is asking for that, but just in cases, the NGOs are asking sometimes for that, but if they have an interest, they don't care about the impact assessment. So, I mean, it's a liar's poker. What would be more interesting in terms of that is to establish more, as we have in the upfront of the Industry Emission Directive, that we have a kind of Sevilla process where you have an ongoing discussion with industry on technologies. There are even NGOs involved. And I think we need more instruments, because right now, the coordination capacity of the Commission in transformative situations like that, and this case-driven scrutiny board issues, and so they're not working. So what we know, it's a process, and we know we need more process-oriented instruments, also with a broader involvement. And I think that is something we are going to amend, also additionally to the question of just permitting.
Yeah, final statements. Camille or Bernd first, and then Camille, you have the last word.
So this is not so much a final statement, but rather picking up on the question of the gentleman from Financial Times on the linkage between the Critical Raw Material Act and the Net Zero Industry Act. So while I completely understand what Mr. Ehler just said, I do think from an objective perspective, the two things need to be interlinked, right? I mean, if we want to deal with the vulnerabilities that we have in terms of critical raw materials, dependency on one supplier, I think there are different, there are different ways to address this. One is diversification. Diversification, by the way, also for hydrogen. I think imports are not a problem per se. It's only if they are not diversified that they become a problem per se. And if that doesn't work to a sufficient extent, which is, by the way, diversification is also important to keep the costs down. So there is again the international perspective that I was mentioning before. And the other thing is, if the question, what can we do domestically? Okay, so there's a mining element. It would be super interesting to discuss this with WWF as well, what your thoughts are on this. But there's also, and there I see a clear interlinkage in my view, the circular economy aspect, which can really make a difference, in my view, from a value and supply chain perspective on both levels. So on the Critical Raw Materials Act, motivation and the Net Zero Industry.
Camille.
Yeah, I mean, if it's a final statement, yeah, I would say that I'm really happy that Mr. Reda just mentioned that if there is a new platform that would be created, there is this idea of involving more stakeholders. I think that would be useful. Also not for, I mean, the EU institution to receive only one stakeholder's point of view, which is like industrial representative point of view, because of course, at the moment, what could be the risk with this act is that everyone wants his sector, his technology to be part of it. And that actually could be damageable for, yeah, reaching our climate targets. So I would just stop here.
Thank you very much. And looking also at the time that we are done, I will not try to summarize this discussion because I think it is not possible and it is not necessary because as we have seen, this proposal that is on the table is raising the challenges and also the issues that need to be addressed, not maybe in one go, as we have seen. It might go also into the new commission. It will be a longer way to go. But I think that all the elements that have been discussed here today have to be openly been on the table within the European Parliament. We don't know how the Council will go about it. But I think that there were a lot of, for me at least, interesting and very, very good proposals that need to be looked into in detail. So for that, I would like to thank the three of you for your participation, for your really very valuable insights. And I did not come here to say that we will go out with a new text agreed among us. That's not the case. But I think with new views on certain aspects that at least for me, I have learned a lot today. And thank you very much, the three of you. Thank you.
So